Right. Okay.
Good news. Good news. Good news.
With Mike Graham, Talk Radio.
And now time to welcome Mr. Peter Hitchens. Without further ado, Peter, how are you?
So far, so good.
Very good, very good. Are you feeling optimistic today? Are you feeling full of the joys of spring? The weather's nice, you know, it's a good day for going out and wandering.
No, I'm scanning the horizon for dark clouds and approaching rain. It's, as I constantly tell you, it's being pessimistic that keeps me so cheerful. Two optimists just ask for trouble.
Yes, it's
The
very
model
true.
is Eeyore, and also the C.S. Lewis character Puddleglum in The Silver Chair, both very sensible characters who kept pessimism alive at a time when others were being foolishly optimistic.
Yes. Well, I must say, this past year, I suppose, has taught anyone who is an optimist not to be quite so optimistic.
No, it doesn't seem to have done, does it? All those poor people went off to Portugal thinking that they'd be able to have a holiday, and what they ended up with was a marathon of being tested and rushing back home before they wanted to, and then they're going to self-isolate for 10 miserable days, presumably being snooped on. They were optimistic, and what happened to them?
Well, right. Yeah, I had a message yesterday.
I know about that.
I had a message yesterday from a holiday maker who made it back, who said she may call in today or tomorrow, but she managed to get back yesterday. She said, I've already had 2 phone calls to check whether I'm in my own house. You know, it seems
remarkable. Have lots more, I think, yeah. And who knows whether people will come around and peer through her windows as well, just in case.
Well, exactly right. And you made the point.
Where we now live. Wee Willie Winky runs through the town. Other people in their beds.
And in case they're not doing that, there are plenty of people who apparently are your neighbours who will happily shop you to the authorities if you do anything wrong.
Well, that depends on your relations with your neighbours, really, doesn't it? If you've cheesed them off at some point in the past 20 years, now's their chance for revenge, isn't it?
Well, exactly right. Now, you made a very good point in your column this weekend about the nonsense, really, of these regulations of travel, banning people from going places, telling them they can go and then making them come back. Given what's going on every single day, particularly in the nice weather, where you and I know at the very least there's hundreds of people a week arriving on these dinghies and being aided sometimes from French waters to get here.
Yeah, well, sometimes you put two things together and it makes extra sense. This is the genius of that great cartoonist, Matt Pritchett, in The Telegraph, who almost every day puts together 2 completely different ideas. What happened with me was that I'd been thinking about writing about this contrast. And then I was in the office talking about somebody well known to me who's in Spain and saying I had no idea how he was going to get back. And then I said, well, perhaps he could get a dinghy and paddle himself across the channel. Everybody laughed. Because immediately everybody got the ridiculous contrast between the way in which the law-abiding and ordinary people of this country are treated at the moment, and the absurd way in which we've completely ceded control of the Channel waters, so that we now pretty much have to welcome into the country anybody who steps ashore there. I know some of the people who come ashore possibly do get sent back, but in general, people who arrive in the country in this fashion don't, partly for the very simple reason that most of them have no passports, and we don't know how to return them or where to return them to. But it is the most extraordinary thing to watch, total impotence in the face of this. I had the same feeling often when traveling to the United States. I once went to the U.S. border with Mexico along the Rio Grande, and you could walk across it. And yet, if I flew into Washington, D.C., let alone Miami, and queued for 4 hours at the passport control, was then questioned brutally by sour-faced immigration inspectors. And I thought, well, what is the point of being in a first world country and traveling legally to another first world country like this? If I just strolled across at El Paso, I wouldn't have any of this fuss. And I know, of course, that there are other problems about strolling across from El Paso, but the fact is that countries make a fetish of their border controls and of everything else, which are abided by law-abiding free people, but they're very, very weak often particularly on migration at the moment. And this extraordinary business on the Channel coast must be worrying. Surely, the whole point about about immigration is you let in who you want to let in. And you decide under your laws and regulations who can come. And people who want to come go through procedures. They fill in the forms. They tell us who they are. We examine their records and we find out whether we want them or not. And they come in or they don't come in. But anybody who gets across the channel in this fashion doesn't have to go through any of that.
Right.
I just think I'm accused of all kinds of horrible things for saying this. I have nothing against these people. I admire their enterprise, actually. I think anybody who's got the guts to set out across the channel, even if they're being ferried by horrible people smugglers, it takes some nerve to do it and some enterprise. But I sympathise with anybody's desire to live a better life than the one they live. But that doesn't mean that we have to go all soppy and say, all right, then you can come in without any further ado.
Yes, but I think
something has to be devised to stop this, to deter it, I think,
yes,
really, from starting in the first place.
Well, I think that's right. But I think the other problem, Peter, is that people assume that these are people of their own kind of will making decisions which then lead them to decide to come independent of anybody else. Whereas I think an awful lot of it is now happening on an industrial scale. And I don't think it could happen on this kind of scale if it wasn't very well organised. And I think it is very well organised. And
it's organised because there's a market for it.
Yeah.
People living in these countries, especially since the fall of Gaddafi, which basically opened up the Mediterranean, and also since the mad Syrian war, which this country, the United States and France have promoted, created so many refugees. There's been an enormous flow of people who now feel they have nothing to hope for at home, and can see the strong possibility that if they keep moving, they will get to a much richer country where there are much better prospects for them. And what the people smugglers do is they extract as much money from them as possible and then promises them more.
Yeah.
They get them into their country of destination and then they blackmail them and continue to pay them. It's a horrible situation to be in. I wouldn't want to be in it. And I'm not in any say saying that the journeys they have are soft or their lives are soft or anything like that. I just think it's wrong for the world to have made this thing possible, because most of the people who take part in it are being hideously exploited and won't achieve the happiness or the prosperity that they seek.
No, quite. But also many of them will end up working inside criminal gangs, and I believe many of them are brought here for that very purpose. And that is also the problem, because the other story...
I simply don't know about that. I mean, there may be occasions. I think I like to presume innocence on all occasions and goodwill and all kinds of other things. Many of these people might well be very good neighbours if they got here. That's not my point.
No, but I'm saying that they're victims, though.
Can't organise themselves to actually maintain their own rules about who should cross borders, and then they help to create this particular form of misery. The other thing is, those people who say, "Oh, well, let them in," I say, do you actually think at all what you're saying? What would a world without borders be like? Some vague, airy, fairy utopian might find it an attractive idea to have a world without borders, but if anybody can get into any country at any time and live there without restraint, what would actually happen to those settled civilizations, especially the more prosperous ones? I don't think anybody, even people who read The Guardian, would actually like it if it happened. We should just be more careful what they wish for.
Yes, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination, Peter, suggesting that these people who are coming into this country are and were always criminals. What I'm saying is that they make a deal with the people traffickers, and sometimes that deal involves them coming here and then being employed in some dodgy business that the people traffickers are connected to. So they're as much a victim as anybody else in the whole situation.
Sure. I think one of the great difficulties about this is the extreme problem of actually finding out what happens to these individuals, because this is the other great danger from this. And it will, and I've been an opponent of identity cards for many, many years. I think they're a terrible imposition. The problem is, if we get enough people in this country who are undocumented and have arrived here illegally and we don't really have any handle on, then the political pressure to have some form of compulsory identity to control, for instance, access both to employment and to the health service and to welfare payments is going to grow. And it's going to be very, very hard for people like me to continue to argue against it. I will. But I think the practicalities of it will make it much harder than it was before. And this is another danger. If you want to have a free society, actually, you have to have strong borders to protect it from outside interference. And this is the difficulty which we're in at the moment. We have weak borders, and therefore it's much, much harder to maintain the freedoms which we had for centuries, which relied on us being an island country, largely unbothered by outside influences and able to control who came into it.
Right. But we now have the rather obscure and rather unusual lawsuit going on where the Department of Children's Services in Kent is basically suing the government to say, enough already. We can't deal with all these kids who are getting into Kent as a result of this migration because we can't cope anymore. There's too many of them.
Has anybody actually asked them how they define children here? I I haven't been looking very closely, but I don't tend to see many children on visible on the.
Well, actually, they define children as anybody up to the age of 25. Strangely.
Well, that's not my definition of child. But,
no.
Okay, but it's always good if you're arguing for public money to do it on behalf of children. Hence, the Child Poverty Action Group is much more effective at getting support than something called the Poverty Action Group.
Yes.
As soon as you introduce the word child, people listen more to what you say. But who can blame the Kent's local authorities for being worried? Because obviously, at the moment, unless you have a distribution system in the country which is quite effective, then most of the people who arrive are going to end up in Kent, which is not, despite its image as the Garden of England, a particularly rich county. So you can see why they're trying to get more money out of the government. But what this means, of course, is the government then has the awkward business of deciding where else to send the new arrivals.
Yes. The other thing that I'm told anecdotally, and again, I have no reason to disbelieve people that live in places like Dungeness, is that not every single dinghy is picked up by the border force. Some of the dinghies actually make it onto a beach, and then those people just get off the dinghy and wander into the countryside. And there's quite a bit of that going on. So there are probably more people coming than we even know.
I would imagine so. And it is, even with modern technology and modern drones, even if you go, the French complain about this, and I believe them, that when they're trying to patrol their own coasts to stop people leaving, as they say they're doing, even with all the surveillance they haven't got the people to rush to the sea to stop it. So you might get a drone saying there's a group of people getting into a boat here, but you haven't got anyone to send. So off they go. And once they're in the channel itself, the chances are very, very strong that they will make it to the British side. So it would take the deployment, if you can't deter people from doing this in the first place, it would take the deployment of very, very large numbers of people to prevent them leaving France and to prevent them from getting into Britain. But ultimately, the folly in this lies in David Cameron's idiotic, inexplicable overthrow of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which turned the country into a cauldron of blood and screams. And also broke down a very major barrier to mass migration from Africa to Europe, which Gaddafi was constantly threatening he would do if people didn't leave him alone. So this is, I know that the Blair creature gets constant stick for the Iraq War. It should be levelled against until the day he departs from among us. But David Cameron, by and large, doesn't get anything like the equivalent amount of criticism for his catastrophic Iraq war, and nor do the idiots who've turned Syria into a pile of ruins and who've also created an enormous migration crisis there. A lot of this stuff is actually stupid political decisions, not taken by the British people, but taken by their leaders, coming home to roost.
So should we then look upon fixing those countries? Because clearly at the moment, I mean, I've seen footage as well, I don't know if you saw it a couple of weeks, maybe last week or the week before, of some people actually swimming to Gibraltar and then around Gibraltar and into Spain, because that's, it's relatively close to North Africa there. And so if this is something that's going to just continue to happen and we can't really stop it, surely the answer then is to go back to those countries perhaps and rebuild them, no?
Well, it certainly would be the current attitude of the Western governments towards Syria and the continuing sanctions against it rather than helping it rebuild seems to me to be remarkably stupid. But I think, given that, my first rule is this: if you don't like this sort of thing, don't start stupid wars. Similarly, if you don't like atrocities, don't start wars. And the willingness of politicians to start wars, and actually of people to support them, has been far too great in the past 20 or 30 years. So stop doing that. But yes, I think there has to be an argument for trying to reconstruct these places. But it's fantastically difficult. It's Humpty Dumpty. If you destroy a country as we destroyed Libya and Syria and indeed Iraq, it's incredibly difficult to put them together again. It'll take years. In the meantime, we have these great numbers of people coming towards this country, and right the way across the richer countries of Europe. And no sort of resolute policy seems to emerge from any place to try and stop this spread of people from continuing. I think obviously what you say is right, that we need to do something about the countries we wrecked, but we also need to do something about deterring people from actually making the Channel crossing, and indeed making the Mediterranean crossing. And it would be good for them, good for us. The only people who would really suffer from that would be the people smugglers, who we would, if we were effective about it, put out of business. But this has to be a cooperative exercise between the countries involved. You can't just, I don't think you can do it unilaterally. We're not Australia. We don't have an enormous passage of sea between us and the people who want to get to us. And therefore, we really have to be doing it in concert, particularly with the French.
Yes, I think that's right, because Priti Patel's efforts, apparently, so far anyway, don't appear to have worked in any way, shape or form. They keep talking about a new bill being produced, but, you know, unfortunately, people in dinghies tend not to pay much attention to laws that they already don't pay any attention to.
No, I know, and I do concede. I don't have any particularly high opinion of Priti Patel as a minister, and I do concede that it is a difficult problem and not one which can just be solved overnight. And I do think that the fundamental lesson we need to learn from it is not to be so blithe about starting wars in the Middle East and indeed in North Africa. But having said that, I do not think it is beyond the wit of man to devise systems to deter people from making this perilous journey, which places many of them in the hands of criminal gangs.
Yes. And finally, Peter, just one thing. I noticed you put a tweet out to Jordan Peterson last week, looking for him. What do you make of Mr. Peterson's efforts to sort of try and make sense of the world?
Well, I think they're quite funny, actually. He seems to me to be a cult figure. I wrote a review of his book. It was at 12. 12 steps to I don't know, was it 12 steps to tranquility, or it sounded like some guru sitting on top of the Himalayan peak, and had slightly ludicrous aspects to it. I get in terrible trouble with his admirers for saying this, because they're completely besotted with him. They worship him. Yes. Criticism is taken very badly indeed. But I thought the book was quite funny, and I'm slightly puzzled that people think of Professor Peterson as being particularly conservative or right-wing, because I don't think he is. And people keep saying, well, why don't you get together? Well, I'm happy to have discussions with practically anybody, and I would do so. I just put out a tweet saying, where are you? I'm ready to rumble. Yeah. I haven't had a response yet. I mean, if a man can stand, 2 hours of Stephen Fry, an hour with me should be easy.
I would have thought so. Yeah, I'd much prefer you than to put Stephen
Fry. I mean, it felt like 5 hours with Stephen Fry.
Yeah, I haven't managed to.
May have been half an hour. I don't know.
I haven't dragged myself through that particular torture yet. I'm saving up a really rainy, horrible weekend for it, I think. Peter, thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist there. Maybe we'll organise the match-up between Peter and Jordan Peterson. That could be quite interesting. We could do it here at Talk Radio TV, as we now are, of course. Don't worry, there's plenty more coming.